And we're back. Welcome back to the Luke Deckard Show. I'm your host, Luke Deckard. Tonight, I have Simon with me of Bay Tales, Virtual Noir at the Bar, Fame, the big cheese, one of the two big cheeses behind behind these ventures. Tonight, I'm super excited because we're talking about Lethal Weapon. Um, I rewatched Lethal Weapon at Christmas, and it had been a while since I'd seen it. I've always loved Lethal Weapon, but I sort of forget how much I love it until I go back. And this last Christmas, I went back and watched it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need to talk about Lethal Weapon. And Simon, you and I started chatting on Twitter. We were like, all right,
Comparing it to Die Hard, I think, really, weren't we? Used to
we were.
Christmas
So
movies.
Simon, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Or joining
for
us, and
having
by
me.
us I mean me tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Do you want to just say a little bit about who you are and what you do and things like that, so people know?
Yes. So, so I'm Simon Buick. I live in the northeast of England now. I come from a publishing background. I was with a publisher for 25 years. And when I moved back up north, I attended one of the Noir at the Bars, which is something that Vic Watson has been running in the Northeast for a number of years, where a bunch of writers get together in a bar and read from their work. And then lockdown hit. Vic put a message out saying, would anybody be interested in if I did a version of this online? My background is in digital marketing in publishing. So I said, would you like any help? And she said, yes. We ran that throughout lockdown. We produced a charity anthology, which you very kindly came on board and edited for us. And that's actually how we met, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we got to know each other through that. Since then, Vic and I have been running Bay Tales, initially as a virtual event and now as a physical event. The first Bay Tales happened last February in Whitley Bay, and the second one is happening on March the 4th, again at Whitley Bay Playhouse. We have Anne Cleves as our patron, and we have about 15, 20 of the biggest writers in the UK coming, talking at the event, and tickets are now available.
Go get them. No, it looks like a lot of fun. It's just your second live, right?
It's the second live one we've done, yes, yeah. And we've got a few fringe events around it this year as well. So if you get a ticket for the main event, you get to come to the fringe events free of charge as well. And we just really try to keep the price down and the value up.
Nice.
But my long-term background, I did film studies back at university when I think there's only two places in the United Kingdom did it way back then. And obviously,
Wow.
I'm so old, it was all silent films and learning how to cut film and tape back together. But
Yes. So when you say fringe events, what are these fringe events? I'm assuming like you mean like Edinburgh Fringe connected stuff.
So basically, after we did last year's show, we said, do people want it as a one-day event or a weekend event? People said, well, we like it as a one-day event and just cram lots in. So
Right.
what we did is we're still charging the same amount as for a one-day event, but we're putting a free event on the Friday night, which is the Noir at the Bar.
Wow.
And then on the Sunday morning, we have Victoria Selman, who is recording her podcast on the sofa live with
Fun.
Abigail Dean and Cara Hunter and Fiona Cummins. So
Nice.
those are two free events either side of it that people can come to if they've got tickets for the main event.
Okay, cool. No, that sounds like a lot of fun. So if you're interested in crime fiction and you're in the UK, or if you're not in the UK and you want to travel to the UK,
It's a
go to
great
Bay Tales.
And it's really about showing people, we've got Anne Cleves as our patron, who's obviously written Vera and Shetland. So much of Vera, is all of it's set in the Northeast. It's a chance for people to get to see some of that scenery and so on that they've seen in the many years that Vera has been on as well. So it's a mixed bunch of writers there for all tastes.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. Cool. So let's dive into Lethal Weapon, because I know that I only have you for an hour. So let's dive in. I suppose what was your actually no. Let's chat about the writing first. Let's chat about Shane Black. Lethal Weapon I found really interesting because Shane Black's approach to this when he was trying to kind of write the first draft of this script, he wanted to do an urban western, and that is funny to me because hard boiled fiction is basically urban westerns.
Hmm.
So it's funny that he uses the term urban western when actually I think he's really just doing a hard boiled detective story,
Hmm.
in the sort of Maltese Falcon, Sam Spade, sort of the Continental Op kind of genre, but injecting a lot more comedy, I think. Um, but because he said he wanted his protagonist to be sort of everyman policeman, just the kind of the guy shuffling down, the streets of LA, which is essentially is the the Continental Op kind of figure. If anyone who doesn't know who that is, it's one of the first big creations of Dashiell Hammett, who was the kind of the godfather of hard boiled fiction that came, afterwards came Philip Marlowe and all that kind of stuff. Um, so that was interesting to me. But what's your take? I mean, do you see this as an urban western, or do you see it as sort of a play on that kind of tough guy detective stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the timing of it in the 80s, there seemed to be, well, it's interesting in a way, isn't it? Because Danny Glover was coming quite quickly off Silverado, which was a kind of Lawrence Kasdan's attempt to do a Western back in the 80s,
Mm,
after the Western had really gone out of vogue,
yeah,
or had become too expensive, and so on and so on. So I think in the 80s, you started to get a few of these films that could, I mean, Roadhouse is, that is a Western
yeah,
in all but name. You've got the new sheriff in town, and you've got the bar fights, and you've got the old gunslinger coming back, and so on and so on. So I think
yeah.
there was an appetite to do that. I mean, interestingly enough, I was listening to the audible version of Quentin Tarantino's film criticism essays,
Oh,
on my drive back from Birmingham yesterday, and he talks a lot. It's really interesting. He was talking a lot about The Getaway,
mm,
and of course directed by Sam Peckinpah, and you've got Steve McQueen and Ali McGraw there, and written by Walter Hill.
yeah.
Now, all this is a very long-winded way of saying it. Shane Black, I think, said when he wrote this script, he was trying to smash together William Goldman, who was a mentor of his, and Walter Hill. So, of course, you've got Walter Hill there that's done things like The Getaway, The Long Riders, Southern Comfort, then did 48 Hours, which in its own way, you could draw Western themes and so on from it.
Mm,
So I think it's quite interesting. Um, but yeah, I mean, compared to a Dirty Harry as a you could say that in its own ways, its own urban western, really. I mean,
yeah.
Clint coming straight off us. So I can see all of that. The other thing I think interesting, Shane Black talking about writing this, is he described the Riggs character as almost like a Frankenstein, that society's too polite to want that Frankenstein figure, but when you
Mm,
get it, very much like the Dirty Harry figure that had been created by was directed by Don Siegel. That sometimes you've got to
yeah.
let that monster out to do things that some of us are too polite to do.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes. Yeah, the character of Riggs I love. But I want to dive into him. We'll discuss him a little bit more a bit later. But I do love what he was trying to do with that character. Um, Shane Black in general. Are you a fan of his other films? Say Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Nice
yeah.
Guys, things like that.
I love Shane Black. I mean, well, I hate him really because I mean he's 22 when he sold Lethal Weapon. So got to hate him
Yeah,
for that. But, I mean, you had that period, didn't you, where it was really him and Joe Esterhazy that
yeah,
seemed to be, well, Shane Black's just sold the script for more money than anyone else in history. Now Joe Esterhazy has. Now Shane Black's kind of overtaken him. So I mean, all of that good stuff that came out, The Last Boy Scout, The Long Kiss Goodnight,
yes.
the rewrites on The Last Action Hero, which I think is a much maligned film, which has
Yeah.
some interesting parts to it. And I really like his directorial stuff as well.
Mhm.
I thought Kiss Kiss Bang Bang was an incredible film.
Yes.
I really like the other guys. Wasn't so taken with his take on on Predator.
Oh
So,
no, that was bad.
and again, I mean, I think we've had this conversation before about how we feel about Rian Johnson and the Star Wars
Yeah,
run of things. I think Shane Black had a similar experience doing the Iron Man. Was it Iron Man 3, wasn't it, that
he
he
did.
did
He
with
did.
Marvel
Yeah.
that some people like, some people absolutely loathe.
I do.
You know,
I'm in the
how
camp
much?
of I like it. I like Iron Man 3. It's much
Yeah,
better than
I
Iron
think
Man 2.
absolutely. I completely agree. But I like Shane Black. I mean, he's got some themes that'll run through everything. You know, you can always guarantee there's a kidnapping
Yeah.
of a family member. It seems in a Shane Black film. But I just like that sarcastic, the quips,
Yes.
so on. I think some of his earlier writing, and we might come onto this with Lethal Weapon. There's some parts of it can be a little bit problematic,
Hmm.
looking at it through today's lens, but I think that's very much why Shane Black moved away from writing those massive, big budget studio films to start directing himself, because he himself was feeling they were becoming almost a parody of a parody, and
Mm.
a bit too commercial at times. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. Um, it's something that kind of never sticks in the front of my mind with this movie is that it's a Richard Donner film. That it's the
mm,
guy who did Superman and other things, but it's the Superman director doing this very violent, kind of irreverent buddy cop, you know action movie, um, which is it's always been a weird one to me to kind of put that together in my head. Um, what I do find interesting though is that Richard Donner had a lot of problems with Shane's script. He liked it, but he didn't like it. There was too it was too dark for him at times,
mm.
and so there were a lot of there were a lot of rewrites and changes because he was trying to lighten it up quite a bit. Um, do you think that should have happened?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting Richard Donner is the director of this film to begin with, because I mean, he wasn't an action film director in that
Mm.
sense. If you look back, I mean, immediately prior to Lethal Weapon, what was it, Goonies, Lady Hawk, The Toy. Do you remember that film, The Toy, with Richard Pryor?
I think yes, yeah,
Superman 2, Inside Moves, which was a very heavy drama with John Savage and Dave Morse. Then he did Superman, and then of course you had the Omen before that, I think, didn't he?
yeah.
So obviously there's action in things like Superman and so on. But one of the things I like about Richard Donner, um, he wasn't really a genre director. He
Hmm.
do lots of different things. And you can see from that list before that there's dark touches in a number of those, but there's nothing really is other after the Omen, I think. Um, that kind of bloody violence,
Yeah.
really. So I can see why you would have issues with it. And also, I think the other thing, probably, as well as the tone, it's probably something to do with budget, because this
Mm.
wasn't a huge budget film. I
No.
think we've got to remember that. It wasn't a summer blockbuster when it first came out. I think it was a March release in
Yep.
1987. It had a budget of $15 million. And Shane Black does like to, with his first script, was writing some big scenes there with blowing up the Hollywood sign and this, that, and the other.
Yeah, what was like
Um,
a truck full of cocaine exploded and coke was meant to be snowing down over the
yeah,
Hollywood sign.
yeah. And you think almost in some ways that's what he managed to get done with The Last Boy Scout,
Mm.
with Tony Scott.
Hmm.
Really, a little bit later, maybe when it had that bigger budget with some of those huge scenes in there. But so yes, I can understand why you would have had some issues with it, and some of the cut scenes that you read before the polished and so on were even darker than they did go. But I
Yeah.
think for a big Hollywood film, there's still some pretty intense moments in there with the suicide contemplation and so on.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, the opening. I guess we can kind of start diving into the actual film now. I mean, the opening itself is quite dark and scary. You got the girl who is tripping on drugs, and she's being reckless, and she's standing on the edge of the balcony. And you kind of, it's a very tense moment, and then of course, then she eventually falls and dies. But then you find out later on that it was, she was, the amount of drugs in her system, she was going to die regardless of whether she jumped or not. But I mean, that in of itself is quite dark, and these, like you said, there are a lot of dark things in this movie. For example, I think, yeah, that moment with Riggs, very very early on, you have that scene of him alone watching Looney Tunes, a Christmas Looney Tunes cartoon, and he's contemplating suicide with a gun. And I think I read somewhere where I think there was an actual bullet in the gun.
Well, apparently the way they filmed it was a blank, but of course the way that a blank expels it was actually, as we've seen in Hollywood films recently with Alec Baldwin and so on, there's always accidents that can happen on the set, and I think it was probably it would have been edited to have not been so quite the way it was back then. Yes. Just going back to the beginning, a moment there. I don't know what you think, but I think it's in one way it's quite powerful because you've got Jingle Bell Rock coming on, you've got the big titles and so on. Then it kind of just stops dead, and you've got this kind of echoey, just background music, and you're going into that slightly spaced out soundscape and go to that character. And that all works very well, but there's something about that scene that the woman has to be naked, so that there has to be bare breasts, there has to be that it almost puts you in the expectation of a slightly more exploitation type of movie, I think, than ultimately it is as a whole. So I don't know. It's that beginning, and Shane Black also always likes a big crash of a beginning like that. If you think to the other guys, there's a similar sort of scene with the young boy reading his pornographic magazine, and the car comes crashing through, and it's the model in there and so on. But I don't know. There's just something about that beginning that it's vital to the story, but it doesn't quite fit the tone. As far as I always felt, it felt slightly different.
Maybe that's interesting, because I think I always viewed that scene as what it reminded me of. It reminded me of just like quintessential 80s action movie. And every 80s action movie that's an R rating will have some sort of, it's typical to see like some ladies' boobs. So when I saw that scene, it does feel gratuitous. It does feel gratuitous, but it's what I expect of an 80s movie. So in terms of exploitation, I mean, probably I would say there's something to that. But as you've just pointed out, there's and also something in the chat as well. It's the exact same opening as The Nice Guys. So it's like, what is Shane Black's? It's something. What is Shane doing with that? Like there's something, that he's trying to come across. And what I want to come to is in the chat is, Frank says Amanda was an adult star, or at least in adult films, and
is in the new Welcome to Chippendales. This new dramatization of the story of the Chippendales and the murder behind that?
No.
It's just started streaming on Disney, and it's the dramatization of the very shady background to the guy that set up the Chippendales. And apparently it's a first acting role since 2011, so she's back for that. What I always felt sorry for her in a sense was that she actually did that jump, that she was, and it's not terribly well filmed to get the most appreciation out of the effort that went into that. When I finally found out that, stunt coordinator actually taught her how to do this, and she did this physical jump. You think
Yes.
that could have been filmed, that could have been shot, because there's so much of it as a point of view shot as she goes down, and then this, that, and the other, that you
Yeah.
think, oh, if you've got an actor that's prepared to put in that, Tom Cruise would have made sure you were on his face the entire time he went down there.
Modern day Tom Cruise. I don't know about 80s Tom Cruise, but
True.
modern day Tom Cruise would have would have made the building higher.
Yes. And just going back to your comment about the the expectation of certain body parts in
Mhm.
80s films. Of course, then you've got the first introduction of Mel Gibson is full on butt shot of Mel
Yes.
Gibson, and I think he must have had it in his contract, because there was just film after film at that point that everyone had Mel's butt in
Yeah.
there on full display.
Yeah.
It's a very economical, broad stroke introduction to his character. That just waking up, cigarette, beer, doing both while he's having his morning ablution or whatever you want to call it. So it's a neat way. You've just had Roger and his bath, which
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't like that idea of people coming in interrupting me while I'm having my bath.
Yeah, now see, out of all the scenes, that's the one that makes me the most uncomfortable. Because I'm like, the dude's just in the bath. Like, why is everyone coming in? Why is everyone okay with this? Why is
Yeah,
his, like 18-year-old daughter coming into the bath? Like, he's like, what
and
is
telling
going
his
on?
18-year-old daughter to give him some sugar while he's in the bath. And there weren't many bubbles in that bath, So I just like my baths and privacy. But
Yeah, no, yeah. That one was odd to me, but it's what I do love about this movie is I love the contrast between Riggs and Murtaugh.
yeah,
I think I think the juxtaposition between those two is great. I don't know which one I can't say that I like one more than the other. They're just such a perfect duo, and I think that's another thing that you can kind of contribute to Shane Black doing really really well is he knows how to write opposite characters that work so well together.
yeah,
And he uses this template many times down the line after this movie. I mean, just the other on my last episode where I was talking about Nice Guys and the similarities between Riggs and Murtaugh and Headley and what's the March in the
yeah,
Nice Guys. They're it's the same sort of template really.
yeah.
Um and I love that. But
And of
you
course, you
think
got Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans. Is Damon Wayans one of the Wayans brothers in The Last Boy Scout
yeah,
with
yes.
that dynamic there,
Yeah.
which is this. It's interesting, this idea that Murtaugh keeps calling Riggs, kid, the kid, this, that, and the other, and so on. So that there is this slight kind of father-son relationship, which is amplified more in The Last Boy Scout. I think that Bruce Willis being older again, and Damon Wayans perhaps being younger. But yes, I mean, I think there's all sorts of interesting things about the age difference and the way it's portrayed and so on. I mean, there's Danny Glover playing a
Yeah.
50-year-old when he's 40, and Mel Gibson playing a 30-year-old, and the teenage daughter played by a 26-year-old. It's a bit like that, that when you look at it in real life, because it makes me feel terrible when I see how good Danny Glover looks at 50, and you think, oh, actually, no, he was only 40 at the time,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. Yeah, he's 40 and Bruce Mel Gibson is 30 playing a 38-year-old.
Yeah,
It's what's funny to me about that is you look at things nowadays and it's the opposite, right? You
yeah,
have people that are much older pretending to be younger.
yes,
Which just it never really works. Very rarely do you have someone younger pretending to be older. I say rarely. I'm sure it happens, but it doesn't seem it seems more obvious, I guess,
mm.
when it's
No, I
the
mean,
other
you've
way
got
around.
Morgan Freeman still popping up as an FBI investigator in every other film when he's 82 years old these days. So, it's that sort of thing. Because Sean Connery did it for years when you were thinking, come on, you're not kidding
Yeah.
anyone, really. But yes, yeah. And both of, I mean, I think one of the things that makes that makes Lethal Weapon stand out for me compared to a lot of the buddy, it's that difference between an actor and a movie star. And
Yes.
it's not too often that the twain shall meet. And I think Mel Gibson really is both a movie star and an actor.
Yeah.
And I like my Arnold Schwarzenegger films, I like my Sylvester Stallone films, some of them, and so on. But
Yeah.
Mel Gibson can go from that 0 to 60 to do the crazy Three Stooges bit,
Yes.
and then in the next scene be contemplating suicide, and you absolutely believe it through that performance.
You do. Just to the chat to pick up on a couple of things that we would have talked about anyway, but Frank mentions that Bruce Willis was considered for Riggs, but he turned it down. It's interesting because I when I first heard that, I was like, oh, that makes sense because of Die Hard, but obviously Die Hard came out a year later.
Well, of course, Mel Gibson was offered Die Hard, and he turned that down.
Yeah,
So
and
they've flipped.
I sort of wonder what these franchises would have looked like with those roles switched. Had Mel done Die Hard and Bruce done Lethal Weapon, how that would that have changed it much, or would it have would it be as loved or as well received as it is now, or would they have?
Yeah.
Or would by changing the lead sort of corrupt that at all?
Yes, I mean I can see in the comments that Christopher Lambert, Stephen Lang, and Christopher Reeve were also considered. I mean, the list of people that were considered just went, it's like a who's who. Everyone from Kurt Russell, Patrick Swayze. I mean, some of the more interesting, I think it was Shane Black wanted William Hurt to do it, didn't he? That was his first choice.
Yes.
Michael Bain. I think he could have been interesting in the role. But he was off doing Aliens at the time. Brian Dennehy considered for the role of Murtaugh. James Wood, Christopher Walken, Keith Carradine, Scott Glenn all considered for Mr. Joshua. But I think the weirdest possible combination, imagine that end fight, spoilers, with Riggs and Mr. Joshua facing off. Imagine if that had been Jeff Goldblum facing off doing karate against Christopher Walken while Brian Dennehy watches on, directed by Leonard Nimoy. That's the way it could have been in some alternative version. And
yeah,
I just cannot see Jeff Goldblum in that role.
No, I can't see any variation of that. I can't see. It's this idea that Leonard Nimoy was considered to direct this movie is so bizarre to me, because this just doesn't seem like anything he would do. I mean, he did a couple of Star Trek movies, and I guess he's done other things, but I'm thinking you want the guy who directed the whales the movie with Star Trek with whales in it, like that's, you want him to do this?
Yeah.
It is a very odd decision, I think. I can't see why they wanted that.
Yeah, I think they went for him, and then they went for Ridley Scott. And Ridley Scott, I could see. But
yes.
Leonard Nimoy, I mean, he actually ended up doing Three Men and a Baby instead, which, you kind of go, well, what are the choices? Lethal Weapon or Three Men and a Baby, which did better box office wise than Lethal Weapon did, but very different films,
Yes. Because Lethal Weapon was, again, it's a March movie. It wasn't meant. The marketing campaign was very small, because it's interesting because it was because of was it Roger Ebert did his review of Lethal Weapon, and that sparked a bunch of people to finally go and see it. So it's also interesting because, like, if he hadn't have done that, would we be here today talking about Lethal Weapon, or would it possibly have kind of become a cult classic over time? Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe.
No, I think
Um,
it's true. Yeah.
but I think what's interesting is yeah. So I like the I kind of want to talk a little bit more about the writing style, because I know
Mm.
we've mentioned a little bit about the suicide scene. But what's so interesting to me is I love the way that this movie drifts between the wackiness and
Hmm.
then the serious drama. I mean, just scenes before, right? You have Murtaugh, who's at the scene of the crime where the girl has committed committed suicide, fallen off top of the building, and he's cracking inappropriate jokes to hookers and things like
Yes.
that, which it's all that I find quite very funny. um and then you go to Riggs's character, who's doing that drugs bust, and they're like, "Oh, you crazy?" And like you're saying, does a Three Stooges bit, and even in that moment, you see that that when Riggs is held hostage and he's screaming at the other cops to just shoot the guy because he
Yeah.
doesn't care about his life. At that point, you think he's kind of being almost righteous, almost sort of willing to be a martyr for the greater good, to some degree. But there's a sense of recklessness to him.
Yeah, you see, the first time I saw it more as a kind of bluff, just to distract the guy, and that
Uh,
is why I think the next scene where you see him contemplating suicide and doing, go, oh, actually,
yes,
he wasn't bothered if they
correct.
shot him and he died. And I think that's quite clever, because I mean the first scene is just him being scruffy and getting out of bed and so on. So
Yeah,
you're not quite sure why. Then you've
yeah,
got the drug scene. Then you've got
yeah.
the potential suicide scene. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that because I love the way that works, and I love the way that on repeat viewing and thinking back, like, oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
he is a sad guy, and I think there's just something so interesting about that moment where he is fiddling with the gun, because it really is a what I would call it's a powerful scene,
Mm,
which in less in the hands of lesser directors and writers would be I think would be just so poorly handled. I can't I struggle to think what how that scene would be handled by a modern writer or a modern
mm,
filmmaker. Because we're in such a comic book overloaded cinema landscape. I'm like thinking about like Captain America, or what those kinds of films, those kinds of actors doing that with the kind
mm,
of directors for hire that do these
mm.
Marvel movies that are basically just babysitters. I'm like,
Well,
I
wasn't there a deleted scene in Edward Norton's Hulk where he tries to commit suicide and shoots himself in the head and
I think so.
finds he can't because he changes into Hulk? And I mean, Edward Norton's probably one of the better actors around today.
Yeah,
But yeah, and,
no, it was great.
um, yeah,
He's
but
great, and that Hulk movie is underrated. That's all I have
um,
to
but yes, I mean, I think that's right, and then you've kind of got the light and the darkness
say.
playing against you, 'cause you've seen the Roger's home life and the kids and the family and so on, and that's a nice twist. I mean, I think there's something important to be said about the fact that you have got Danny Glover there, and Mel Gibson, the white cop and the black cop,
Yeah.
and again back to Shane Black's writing, that he didn't write them that way. Hence
Mm.
why Brian Denny could have been, and I think it was Richard Donner who originally, when he'd been told, "Oh, you should get Danny Glover from Color Purple," and he said, "But he's black," and it was he himself. I heard him saying this on an interview, and he was very open about it. He said, and I suddenly thought, why am I thinking that? What does that matter?
Yeah.
But I think for that time, coming off the back of something like 48 Hours, which is very, very much all the humor, or a lot of the humor in that, and Beverly Hills Cop 2 really is race based.
Yeah.
That is not the case in Lethal Weapon. I think there are some issues at certain points, but I really like that it wasn't that film that those other films had been. That
Yeah.
it's not that it didn't matter, because it does, and certainly as the series goes on, there's more made of that. But I don't know. I just thought it was an interesting.
I agree. I like that too. I like that it was. It's there, and you have you're but there's no signposting. And again, this is why I keep I think about how this film could would be done today, and I feel like it would be bogged down by various political agendas if they tried to do Lethal Weapon today. And I guess they are doing it today because there is a TV show, and I've not seen the TV show, but the way that this movie just sort of acknowledges but doesn't acknowledge the kind of the race component. It's like there's no kind of big deal to be made. It's just, this is life. They're friends. They're learning to like each other. And race doesn't really come into it. They're just two individuals who work in the police department, right? There's no cheap comedy at the expense of one being white and one being black, which I think helps this film retain, but continue to be accessible today.
And I think what's interesting, there's two things when you compare it to the sequel, Lethal Weapon 2, which I don't know which I prefer, but two things I would say. One thing I like about Lethal Weapon 1 is the fact that Riggs's wife has died in a car accident. In a typical 80s exploitation cop thriller, she'd have been, Steven Seagal's wife would have been killed by the mafia, and he would have been going after them to get revenge. And it's not. It's just an accident, something that's happened, and that he's trying to live with. And backing that with the issue of how much color and so on goes into that. Well, both those things are kind of not retrofitted, but addressed or retrograded in Lethal Weapon 2, which of course has the whole South Africa diplomatic immunity and all of that, where race does become much more of an issue from the villain's point of view. And you could argue at some points it's a little bit heavy-handed in the way that is put across. But I think part of that is Richard Donner's beliefs, and part of it very much is Danny Glover for all the charity work and so on that he's done over the years, and his belief. And the other thing is, of course, you find out it wasn't a random accident that caused Riggs's wife's death and so on. So I actually quite like the first Lethal Weapon film for not having to have that as a central part of the puzzle and so on. It's just shit happens, and
yes. Yeah, I agree. I don't. Yeah, I don't. I didn't. That was one bit in Lethal Weapon 2 that I kind of didn't like. I didn't like them making something out of her death. It's a little cliche, I think. It was fine. It makes me, her initial death in the car crash sort of reminds me of if you've read I'm assuming you've read the Maltese Falcon, and there's the Flint Craft parable in there, which if you don't remember, it's Samus Spade is talking to someone about just kind of random chaos, and he's looking for a guy goes missing, and he goes looking for him. Someone's husband goes missing, goes looking for him, finds him, in a whole new life. And when he sits and talks to him, says, well, The reason I did it was because one day I was walking down the street and I was almost, piano almost fell and, crushed me, killed me, right? And so he was like, I'm going to take life by the horns and live it how I want to live it. The irony is that he's living a virtually identical life to what he was previously. But it's the chaos of that stuck with me, that we don't know when something's going to happen, and it's not always connected to something big and nefarious. So I would have liked Lethal Weapon 2 a little bit more had they not done that.
Yeah.
And just sort of left that bit alone. There is, I suppose, a mild setup in Lethal Weapon 1 that kind of hints at 2, and that is on the refrigerator at Murtaugh's house. They have the apartheid sticker.
Yes.
Which it's so, everyone sees it, but then it's kind of fun that they do make something out of that.
Yes.
In
And they
the
make sure you see it because it actually changes position so that you're seeing it in every shot.
Yes.
But yes, yeah, and it's, I think as the series went on, the themes or the causes that the makers wanted to address did become more overt, and whether it's don't eat the tuna at one point, this was this kind of slightly heavy-handed way, but I just
Yeah.
really like the simplicity. I think is one of the Lethal Weapon has a mutual respect for Riggs and Murtaugh is
It's true. The other thing I quite like is the is kind of like the general their character arcs in the first movie. I love that. I love that Riggs is this kind of unstable, on the edge, willing to pack it all in, kind of character who his arc becomes. He doesn't become tame, but he becomes a bit more human, I guess, by the end. He's not so crazy, and I really I like the way he transitions from so reckless to actually he wants to be a part of the family, right? He wants to be he's best friends with this guy now. He wants to be part of the family, and that kind of final moment at the end where he comes over for Christmas and the present that he gives Murtaugh is the bullet, right? Which I found a really nice kind of. It's wrapped up quite nice and neatly. You're not sitting there wondering if he's gonna, off himself at any other point. But I also like Murtaugh's arc, where he goes from this kind of he's a bit grumpy, he's a bit tired, he's ready to be done. He's I'm tired of this shit. I'm too old for this shit, right? To this vengeful father, right? My daughter's been kidnapped. I'm going to, nothing is off the table now. That nothing is going to stop me. Like I will. He becomes ready to die, in the way kind of, in the way that kind of Riggs was at the beginning, and kind of
yeah.
throughout. He becomes reckless towards the end, whereas before he's kind of the one who's a bit more put together and stable. I quite like that juxtaposition though with that. I don't know. What are your thoughts on his arc?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to play because obviously you need the straight man to in anything. You need the straight man to the comedian, or you need the straight man to the action guy, or the whatever. I mean, how much of an arc does he have, and how much it goes over one film, and how much it goes over four? I think is an interesting question. But it's I mean, one of the nicest scenes I think is when he's out in the boat and he doesn't he's bought a boat. He doesn't know the first thing about boats, but he thinks he wants to retire, to be able to relax in this boat, and that it's the little scenes actually in Lethal Weapon that I prefer to the big set pieces between the two characters, and to see that interaction and the way that they change. So, for instance, I think the jumper scene where Riggs, is sent to talk to the guy down, they end up jumping. I really don't like that scene. I mean, it's a combination of some of the worst acting from the guy that's going to jump, and it doesn't fit the logic. It doesn't work logically. I mean, did they not notice a huge balloon was down there? But
Yeah,
what works is that going back to Murtaugh, that next scene when they're in the cafe and he realizes he's not trying to pull a psycho pension, that he is really like this, and it's those scenes, the scenes in the garage, the scene there, the scene on the boat outside,
yeah,
the scene is they're coming together and actually starting to like each other. That I think Glover does some of his best work in the film,
yes,
and that work best for me.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I agree with that with the big bouncy balloon thing at the bottom. It reminded me of when I watched it at Christmas. It reminded me of Sherlock, Sherlock season 3, where
Mm,
they explain the way in which he survived, and that was he fell onto a big balloon, and they just got it out of the way in time. It was so
yeah.
like anyone who is there is going to see that. The guy on top is going to see them. I agree. I didn't like that. Um, but in the chat, Frank, I like Frank's point here. He mentions that Murtaugh is a lost dog who finds a home. Which I agree. I agree with that point. He also says maybe the bad acting was intentional. He's just a rich yuppie type. He's not dealing with real pain. Riggs is. Um, what do you think?
You're much more generous than I am. I mean, there's a few bad performances in the movie. It's again. I think it just goes back to that idea that you can see it's a whatever it was, a $15 million film, and not a, it was put together quickly. And I think some of the secondary third characters are not quite as fully realized as
Who would you like to be more realized? I'm curious.
um probably, I mean, Rihanna's boyfriend with the dimples
Yes.
that
Yep.
we never
Yep.
get to see. He's just murdered, and which, in all seriousness, I think that is a very difficult balance to do, and it doesn't always land on the right side, because
Mm.
during that scene where she has been kidnapped and they rescue her, and she's been, well, led to believe, threatened with rape, or certainly been beaten up quite badly, and they get out there, her boyfriend's been murdered and so on. She's a 16-year-old girl and so on. And the next thing you know, that both her father and his partner are kind of making the quips and so on. So that is where sometimes you have to kind of draw yourself back and say, yeah, it's not a documentary that we're talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. So I'm just aware that we have to wrap up in about 12-ish minutes. The ending. I want to talk about the ending.
Yes.
Um, if the two things that I if I had my criticisms, right, the two things would be the scene that you mentioned with the guy, the jumper scene, um, and the second one would be the fight scene outside of Murtaugh's house. It's so ridiculous. It's so like 80s. We're into martial arts. We need a big martial arts fight. And then there's a sprinkler system going. It's not raining. It's just a sprinkler system going off. And Gary Busey and Mel Gibson are just going at it for forever.
Mm,
Um, and Murtaugh and all the cops are there. And Murtaugh's like, no, just let him do it. I'm taking responsibility. Just let him
yeah.
do it. And I'm like, why?
You know what
Why?
annoys me even more than that
What?
is the fact that they've just let two policemen be killed to get to that point. So the
Mhm.
two patrolmen sitting outside
Yeah.
in the car, and Mr. Joshua comes up and kills them both. Well, Riggs and Murtaugh had left a note by the Christmas tree saying something like, "Sorry, bad guys, we're not here." And you're like, you just let two of your colleagues get murdered. If you knew they were coming, why did you?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that is where you have to suspend your disbelief. And I know I've read about how they combined lots of different fighting styles, and they got jiu-jitsu and floor grappling and this, that, and the other. But it
Yeah.
does go on quite a while. And as well choreographed as it is, it did feel like we've got to have the big showdown here, and
Yes.
even more so, well, we've got to have that slow motion, reach for the gun, pull out of the holster, and
Yes.
yes,
Yes.
I get it that they're both coming together and they both fire the shots at the same time to say, they're symbiotic, two sides of the same
Yes.
coin, whatever
Yes.
it may be. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't need to see another slow motion shot. Sam Peckinpah did all of that sort of stuff years ago, and yet we kind of get it in Die Hard. We get it in Lethal Weapon. It's just such a favorite.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah. That
yes,
was the one
I
thing I.
agree.
Go on. Go on.
No, I'm just saying I agree with you. I mean, I think, a couple of things I've mentioned, the music, because I know somebody did
Mm,
ask on Twitter about that the other day. They were commenting. How do you feel about the music in the film?
yes. I quite like the music. It is on one level it's very very 80s. Both the guitar and the saxophone. Um, but I think as you pointed out in the response on Twitter, it's you know Clapton is doing Riggs' stuff, and then I can't remember the guy who does.
David Sanborn.
Yes, yeah, you know, and I kind of like the dance between the guitar and the saxophone and how they kind of overlap as the characters overlap and things like that. I re-listened to the score in kind of prep for this, and I found myself really enjoying it.
Yeah,
I really it's a very good score,
yeah.
by Michael Kamen, who this is for Frank, but Michael Kamen did the score for the very first X-Men movie. Um, anytime I can make an X-Men connection, I got to make it for Frank.
I mean,
Um,
before Lethal Weapon, he hadn't done a huge amount. I mean, he did the Dead Zone,
mhm,
um,
mhm,
Brazil, Highlander, I
mhm.
think, and of course it's that Edge of Darkness, the BBC version of the series that he did with
Yeah,
Eric Clapton, that kind of brought him to the attention of it. I mean, David Sanborn is one of my favorite musicians, and I want to see him at the Royal Albert Hall
oh, cool.
probably about the same time as this film came out, actually. And he was just fantastic. Royal Albert Hall, the Barbican, somewhere like that. And he's just one of those people that's played with everyone. David, Young Americans, saxophone in Young Americans. That's David Sanborn.
Yeah,
Um, James Taylor, Bruce Springsteen he's played with, it's Mick Jagger, I mean, just absolutely everyone. He was the go-to guy to get into to do the sax parts on everything. And I do hear sometimes people say, oh, it's so corny, it's so 80s, it's this, that, and the other. But I think it goes to the whole thing of Lethal Weapon that it's almost become it's because it's been parodied or homaged or whatever you want to say, as so many scenes in Lethal Weapon have, really, that I think if you look at Lethal Weapon now for the first time, you'd think, yeah, I've seen all this before. And you think,
mm,
actually, you've seen it before because Lethal Weapon did a lot of it first.
yeah,
Um, I, I, I just asked you before we started whether you'd seen the film Dragged Across Concrete,
yeah. And I haven't.
which is a really divisive film. It's directed by S. Craig Zala that did Bone Tomahawk and
Mm,
Riot and Cell Block 99.
mhm,
And it's Vince Vaughn and Mel Gibson.
mhm.
And I'd be really interested in knowing what you thought about it. My wife didn't like it. It's a long film. And it
Yeah,
kind of starts off with Mel Gibson's cop character doing one of, and again, this happened more and more as the series went on, the beating of criminals
mhm,
for almost comic effect,
mhm.
and oh, it doesn't matter, he's just slapping this guy around, and oh, look, he smashed that guy in the face, but he's got a quip at the end of it, which happened more and more through 2, 3, and 4 Lethal Weapon. And I
Yeah,
think at the beginning of Dragged Across Concrete is very interesting, because Mel Gibson's character does this type of thing, and he's suspended, and he's going to lose his job, and this, that, and the other, and it's quite meta because you've got Mel Gibson, for all his flawed characteristics as a person,
yeah,
taking on this very flawed police character. So that's quite meta in itself, I think. But then also the comment on films that, this sort of stuff that in the 80s, every cop, whether it was Stallone or whoever it was,
Mm,
you would just laugh along with it. And of course, in
yeah.
today's society, you look at this and go, actually, this isn't always funny,
Yeah.
especially if it's not especially, but in this case, I think it was a minority criminal, and
Right.
it gets very, very dark. This film, Dragged Across Concrete, very, very violent.
Yeah.
So it's not like a Lethal Weapon film, but I think as a juxtaposition of it, it's really interesting to have a look at.
Yeah, I want to. I remember you mentioning it to me. I think before Christmas or at Christmas when we were talking about Lethal Weapon. Um, it is on my list to watch. But yeah, it is 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Yeah,
That is a heck of a runtime. That is a heck of a runtime.
and
Um,
it's like one of those. It's right. It's slow, very conversational. Vince Vaughn is really good in it. Who I think is often, he'll often rely on his shtick. Whereas when you see him in something like Clay Pigeons, which I don't know if you've ever seen that, which was an
mm-mm.
early film with Joaquin Phoenix, and Janine Garofalo, I can never say that name. It's a fantastic Texas noir serial killer film, really
Right.
worth looking out for. But yeah, I mean, Lethal Weapon as a film, it was incredibly influential on me. I mean, I had to make a film for my final dissertation when I
Mm,
was doing my degree in film studies, and
yes.
I'd say I played homage, but I copied shot for shot the suicide contemplation scene within my film.
Mm,
Uh, Within that, and actually reference Lethal Weapon on the screen in the background and so on. So as a viewer, it was just great, and I looked out for every Shane Black film that came out. That his scripts are just so easy to read. I think I love.
yes,
Do you like reading scripts?
I do. I do.
Yeah, and some people do them well. Some people you think, oh well, this will make a good film. But a good script by a good scriptwriter, I think I can just read it. Well, it's almost like reading a comic book that
It is.
you
Yeah.
don't have to put as much time in as you would reading a novel, but you get all the good bits
You
there.
do. I recently read the pilot episode of Luther, because the BBC released them all, and so I was downloading them so I could have them forever. And it's the same. It reads like it reads like a book. Like it's so visual. You can see
Yeah,
what they're going for. It's such a punchy script. And I read, yeah, a good script will do that. A good script will feel like a book. It'll really everything will jump out. You can really see everything that's happening.
yeah.
Which yeah, I enjoy. And Shane Black, he nails it. He is one of my favorites.
And I think you can see the influence of William Goldman in it because the
Yeah,
style of being able to read the breaking, so many rules of script writing in terms of the description and so on and so
yes,
on. But you know, if I
yes,
could
yeah.
break the rules like that and
I know,
and
right?
make a film like Lethal Weapon when I was 22,
I know. The very last thing I want to just touch upon before we go, so we got a couple minutes left, and Frank is sad, and Frank, I'm sad too, and I'm sure Simon is as well.
yeah.
Um,
If it had been next week when my wife was away, we could have played all night. But
we could have done Lethal Weapon 1 to 4 and the
yeah,
TV show.
I'm on
Um,
dinner duty tonight.
but the TV show, have you? I want to know your opinion on it. I have not seen it. I don't want to see it.
Well, I think it's interesting because, of course, it's much more episodic.
Mm,
Damon Wayne's got to be a bit cooler than Danny Glover. Obviously, felt the need to be. So he's
yeah,
a bit more hip. He's a bit more.
right,
The guy had to be a bit more edgy, and of
right.
course, the ironic thing is the actor playing the Riggs. Was involved in some sort of controversy that meant they ended up killing off his character at the end of the first season.
Wait, they killed Riggs?
Yeah, Spoiler, sorry. And
They didn't recast. They just
uh,
killed him.
they killed him and brought in a replacement. There was American Pie,
Oh my god.
Sean Scott Williams, is it?
Oh my god. Okay.
and
Okay.
and I think at that point, yeah, I think they weren't sure whether this controversy was going to be too much, and then they decided it was. So it felt very much kind of like, oh, I mean, spoilers if anybody wants to watch the Lethal Weapon film, but it was basically they introduced this idea that he had a son, and they were clearly going to build on this big story arc, but then he did naughty things, so it ends up with him at his wife's grave, and the son just comes up behind him and shoots him and kills him, and it was just the most. So yeah, I didn't love it. I watched it, but I think it went after that when they tried to replace it and say, well, Martin Riggs is dead, but here's a new guy that's even tougher and came from an even tougher background. Just went.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
That is absolutely insane. I didn't know that. I didn't know that they killed off Riggs. It's interesting because Shane Black wanted Riggs to die in the second film.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, but they seem to have done they used that bit of source material for a stupid reason, for a stupid show.
Yeah, I mean, this suddenly, this son that you never knew had that's now a troubled teenager and
Yeah,
so on. I mean, I can't even remember the details in full.
that's
That's how
okay.
memorable it was, but that's the gist of it. Yeah,
That is okay. Yeah, Frank in the chat is saying Sean William Scott, and
that's
yeah,
right.
he's listed in the starring Sean William Scott. So
Who I
there you
like,
go.
and but it was a hell of a, it's like asking, you come on and say, right, well, yeah, Sylvester Stallone has played Rambo for all these years, but anyway, we just killed Rambo off screen, and you're going to be the new one, so just go with it. It's
Yeah.
that kind of iconic enough character that you just think, nah, you did him dirty a bit on that.
No, yeah, you recast. You just recast. If that's the problem, you just recast.
Yeah,
But also don't do a Lethal Weapon show. But
yeah.
anyway, I know you need to go. Simon, this was a lot of fun. This was a lot of fun.
It was
Thanks
great
for
fun. We really only covered the first half of the film, and then the very
just
last. We didn't talk about the shooting gallery scene,
I
which I think
know.
is one of the best, my favorite scenes ever, with the smiley face and the
Yes.
and just going back. There's so many great individual scenes in that movie, and it's still watching it again in preparation for this. It just reminded me, yeah, it's so good. I might even put myself through Lethal Weapon 4 again.
Yes, yeah. That was my take. Is as I said to you before we started, is like I've not actually seen 3 and 4. I've only stuck with the first two, and I think it's because Shane Black is connected to the first two, and
Hmm.
he's not with the other two, and I'm kind of like, I know they're not as good. I know they're not as good, so I kind of don't want to ruin Lethal Weapon, right? Like 1 and 2 are just a great duo, and I don't want to ruin it. Don't want to
I
ruin it.
think it was Lethal Weapon 3 where, I mean, they didn't even have a shooting script finalized when they started shooting it, and it does kind of come across that way, considering you've got such a meticulously strict script from Shane Black, that as it went on, it just felt a bit more like a cash grab, and that everybody's having fun making it, but maybe they
Yeah,
weren't quite as much fun to watch.
yeah.
But yeah.
But there we are. Frank says that Lethal Weapon 3 is pure 90s. And Shane Ford, who's just joined, says that 4 has some good action.
It does, and I mean, you put Jet Li in any action scene, it's going to be good. It's just,
Mm,
I think some of the problems, whether I mean, there's a couple of racist comments in Lethal Weapon 1, in the torture scene. There's a racial slur that really doesn't sit too well. There's some
yeah,
the homophobia is pure 80s Hollywood throughout it,
yeah,
dropping the F bomb and things like that um that when they're still appearing in Lethal Weapon 4 with
yeah,
so particularly Asian
yeah.
players, I think you think, come on, We've moved on
Yeah.
from this, surely, but
Yeah, especially when you consider like the first two were quite, especially the second one is quite aware of
yeah.
race issues. So to lean into them, yeah, I'm with you on that. But yeah, anyway, there we go. I don't want to make you more any later than I already have. But
Well, thank you very much for having me.
you're welcome. We can come back for Lethal Weapon 2 and finish off talking about Lethal Weapon 1.
Well, I mean, there's so many 80s films I could just talk forever about, 80s and 90s film, you know.
Same. Cool. Well,
Thanks a
enjoy
lot for
your
having
night.
me, Luke.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot,
Enjoy
man.
your night, and everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. I'm back on the 15th. I'll be chatting with James Benmore about Silence of the Lambs. That's what that's next on the docket. So that should be fun. But yeah, anyway, have a good night, everyone, and we'll see you next time.